High school, often romanticized as the best years of our lives. A place where friendships are formed, dreams take shape, and futures are quietly molded between the bells that mark the passing of each hour. But for some, those fluorescent-lit hallways aren't filled with promise. Instead, they echo with isolation, pressure, and quiet despair no one notices until it's far too late. At Crestview High School, it seemed like everything was in its rightful place. The popular kids ruled the lunch tables, teachers scribbled lesson plans with a kind of routine precision that only years of practice can create, and the principal gave the usual Monday morning announcements with tired optimism. Everything seemed normal. But normal is just what we see on the surface. Hidden in plain sight, beneath the weight of textbooks and half-finished homework, was something far more dangerous, a plan as meticulous as it was terrifying, unfolding quietly in the mind of someone no one had ever thought capable. There was no warning sign scrawled across the walls, no sudden dramatic outburst that could hint at what was coming. There was just silence, a dangerous kind of silence, the kind that speaks louder in hindsight. Her name was Emma Carter. To most, she was just another face in the crowd, a good student, quiet but polite, the type of person teachers described as no trouble at all. She wasn't popular, but she wasn't isolated either. She existed in that gray area where no one paid too much attention, a shadow in the backdrop of teenage life. But every shadow has depth. Every smile can mask something else entirely. The morning of March 17th started like any other. Students shuffled into class, their eyes heavy with exhaustion, their minds already counting down the hours until the final bell. No one noticed Emma's hands tighten around the straps of her backpack. No one noticed the weight of what she was carrying, not just the gun tucked away in a hidden compartment, but the months of frustration, anger, and thoughts she'd never dared to voice. The question wasn't just how this happened. It was why no one saw it coming. Was it the pressure of grades? The sting of isolation? Or was there something deeper, something darker, festering beneath that quiet exterior? By the time anyone realized, the pieces were already in motion. And the most chilling part of all? Emma didn't stand out because she was dangerous. She stood out because she was invisible. This is the story of the day Crestview High School came terrifyingly close to becoming the next headline in a long list of tragedies, and how the warning signs, if there were any, went unnoticed until it was almost too late. In stories like these, there's always the temptation to search for monsters hiding in plain sight. But what if the real horror isn't the monster you expect? What if it's the silence, the neglect, the moments everyone missed? What if the scariest thing about Emma Carter's story isn't what she did, but how easily it could happen again? In the quiet corridors of Crestview High School, routine ruled everything. Bells chimed with clockwork precision, students flowed through hallways like water through narrow pipes, predictable, contained, forgettable. Emma Carter was no different, at least on the surface. A perfect GPA, polished essays, polite nods to teachers. She was the kind of student whose absence might not even be noticed until her name wasn't called during roll. But it's always the quiet ones who leave the deepest echoes. While her classmates obsessed over tests and teenage drama, Emma's mind was elsewhere, looping through a single poisonous thought: he can't get away with it. But what was it? That's where the story begins to blur, between whispers in the dark and truths too dangerous to speak aloud. Jonathan Wells, a teacher of 10 years, known for his charm, his patience. The kind of man who remembered birthdays, who stayed late to help struggling students. Parents trusted him. Colleagues admired him. But trust is fragile, easily broken, easily manipulated. And Emily, she saw something no one else dared to notice. Her phone became a silent confessional, each message a stitch in a tapestry of rage. But these weren't the frantic outbursts of a teenager grasping for attention. They were methodical, deliberate. Every word was a thread tightening around the truth. How many others? That was the question clawing at the walls of Emma's mind. But questions like that have sharp edges. Get too close, and you're bound to bleed. It wasn't jealousy. It wasn't anger. It was recognition, the unmistakable realization that predators don't always hide in shadows. Sometimes they thrive in the spotlight, masked by kindness and reputation. And sometimes the only way to stop them is to become the thing they fear most. Her plan wasn't born in a burst of rage. It grew slowly, like mold beneath wallpaper. Days turned into weeks. Every encounter with Mr. Wells became a study in control, a game of proximity and patience. He never noticed her watching, never sensed the trap quietly forming around him. Predators rely on invisibility, on people looking the other way. But what happens when the quietest girl in the room starts seeing everything? When her silence stops being submission and becomes strategy? March 12th, just another date on the calendar for everyone else. But for Emily, it was the deadline for justice, delivered not through courts or whispered apologies, but by her own hand. The question wasn't whether she'd act, but how far she'd be willing to go. Some stories end with redemption, some with regret. But others, they end with the quiet click of a locked door, the steady drip of consequences unfolding behind closed eyes. And sometimes, the perfect student doesn't need saving. Sometimes, she's the reckoning no one saw coming. The silence was deafening. No tears, no frantic explanations, only a chilling stillness that unsettled even the most seasoned detectives. What they expected was remorse. What they got was calculation, buried under layers of composure too perfect for someone her age. The notes revealed the extent of her obsession. Each outcome was written without emotion, as though she were drafting a strategy for a game only she understood. Outcome 1. Confrontation, minimal force necessary. Outcome 2. Public humiliation, psychological advantage secured. Outcome 3. Permanent silence. The final note bore no embellishment, just a single inked checkmark beside it. The school surveillance footage told a story of its own. Emma didn't rush. She didn't hesitate. Every movement was measured, purposeful. She wasn't a teenager in crisis. She was following a plan, step by precise step. Then came the question no one wanted to ask. Where did she learn this level of control? Investigators turned to her home life, a fractured household, a father whose presence was more ghost than guardian. A man whose legally registered firearm became the instrument of a decision Emma had already made long before that final confrontation. The journal offered no confessions, no cries for help. Instead, it catalogued behaviors, reactions, vulnerabilities, her peers reduced to patterns and probabilities. Was this the product of isolation, or something far more innate? The line between victim and predator blurred with every discovery. The weapon was another puzzle piece. The safety was off. The bullets loaded days before the attack. This wasn't an act of sudden rage, it was anticipation. A waiting game, executed with the precision of someone who had rehearsed every possibility. What stopped her from sending those messages? Was there a flicker of hesitation before the final act, or had she decided that understanding wasn't part of her endgame? The truth remained locked behind her silence. Psychological evaluations painted a chilling portrait. Emily wasn't driven by impulse, but by a belief in her own intellectual superiority. A desire not for revenge, but for dominance. She didn't want him to suffer. She wanted him gone, an erasure as methodical as it was merciless. In the end, the most haunting question wasn't why Emma did it, but how long she had been preparing to. Every detail, every note, every silent observation suggested a disturbing truth. This wasn't the story of a teenager pushed too far. This was the story of someone who had already decided how the story would end, and had made peace with the aftermath long before anyone else knew a tragedy had begun. February 14th was supposed to be like any other day. The hum of fluorescent lights overhead, the distant shuffle of textbooks, whispered conversations about weekend plans, and notes passed beneath desks. But for Emma, every tick of the clock echoed like a countdown she couldn't escape. The bell rang, sharp and final, not the signal of release, but the start of something far more irreversible. She was found in the bathroom, pacing in tight, mechanical circles. The gun was steady in her hand, almost too steady for someone her age. Her face, blank. A void where fear or anger might have lived, replaced by something more dangerous, emptiness. The intercom crackled to life. A teacher's voice trembled as they announced the unthinkable, lockdown. Doors slammed shut. Desks scraped across floors, dragged in desperate attempts to create barriers. Students flattened themselves against walls, hearts pounding in their throats. For them, the terror was external, an unknown danger just beyond the door. But for Emma, the terror had been internal all along. Moments later, footsteps thundered down the hall. Then, silence. The silence was worse. Police intervened just before tragedy could unfold. Her hands, once rigid around the weapon, suddenly fell limp. She offered no resistance. No tears. No remorse. Just the quiet surrender of someone who had already lost long before the authorities arrived. Trials are supposed to offer clarity, to divide the guilty from the innocent in sharp, unwavering lines. But Emma's case, it was anything but clear. The prosecution painted her as a predator, calculated, cold-blooded, and entirely in control of her own darkness. Every social media post was scrutinized, every journal entry twisted into a roadmap of premeditation. The prosecutor's voice rings through the courtroom, crisp and unforgiving. This was not a cry for help. This was preparation. This was intent. But the defense told a different story, one of silent suffering. They spoke of isolation so thick it became suffocating, of endless days spent drowning beneath the weight of untreated depression and anxiety. Childhood trauma. Bullying that chipped away at her until there was nothing left but the need to be seen, even if it was in the worst possible way. The defense attorney's voice softened, almost pleading. This was a broken child, screaming in the only way she thought the world would hear. Days turned into weeks as the evidence stacked higher. Expert witnesses debated the line between calculated malice and psychological collapse. Was Emma a monster, shaped by cruelty and fueled by rage? Or was she a victim herself, a casualty of neglect, of a system designed to punish rather than heal? And then, the final moment, the verdict. The courtroom held its breath as the words were spoken aloud, guilty of attempted murder. A sentence as heavy as the silence that followed. 25 years. A lifetime for someone who hadn't even begun hers yet. But what does justice look like in a case like this? Is it the cold sterility of a cell, or should it have been the warmth of rehabilitation, the chance to rebuild what was broken inside her long before that gun ever found her hand? Her story didn't end with a headline. It lingered in the hallways of her former school, where students still glance over their shoulders, wondering what signs they missed. It echoed in every assembly about mental health, every whispered rumor about why she did it, and every counselor's office, flooded with students too afraid to speak until it was almost too late. Some say Emma's sentence was deserved, that actions have consequences, no matter the pain behind them. Others argue she was failed long before the courtroom lights ever flickered on. But the truth is, for every Emma, there are countless others unseen, unheard, balancing on the same fragile edge between desperation and destruction. And sometimes, the real tragedy isn't the crime that was committed. It's the one that almost was. But as the days turn into weeks, and the headlines fade from the front pages, The real story festers quietly in the background, a silence louder than any siren. For every answer the investigation offers, new questions rise, darker and far more unsettling. Who failed Emma first? Was it the teachers who saw the signs but looked away, convincing themselves it was just another troubled teenager going through the motions? Was it the counselors, buried under mountains of paperwork, who missed the one cry for help that mattered most? Or maybe it was all of us, those who scrolled past her story on their screens, too distracted by the next tragedy to let this one sink in. Because it's easy to paint her as a monster once the damage is done. It's easier still to forget she was ever human at all. But monsters aren't born overnight. They're built, piece by piece, out of neglect, silence, and the invisible weight of being unseen. Every skipped conversation, every ignored cry for help, every "she'll be fine," each one, another brick in a prison no one else noticed until it was too late. And yet, maybe the most frightening thing isn't Emily's story itself, but how familiar it feels. How many halls echo with laughter that hides something darker? How many students walk home with shoulders hunched, carrying secrets heavier than their backpacks? How often do we mistake silence for strength? How often do we choose not to ask, because the answer might be too much to bear? Now, the classrooms sit empty. The lessons continue, but the questions remain, suspended in the air like the dust in the sunlight. Would a conversation have changed the ending? Would a different choice, a little more patience, or a glance held a moment longer have rewritten the final chapter? But the most haunting stories are the ones with no clear villain. No singular act of cruelty, no final blow. Just a collection of small moments, small failures, that build into something catastrophic. And so, Crestview High School moves on, because it must. New students fill the halls, fresh laughter replaces the echoes of what was lost. But beneath the routine, beneath the normalcy, there's a question left unanswered. How many Emma will walk these halls before we finally learn to notice? The bell rings one last time. Class dismissed. If you found this story as unsettling as I did, there are countless more cases waiting to be uncovered. Like, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next twisted chapter, because sometimes the truth is more terrifying than fiction. Bye, until next time.